Hey everybody, my name is Diego. We are going to be doing some CSS today. So before we get started, I want to know if people can hear me, if they can see me, if everything is all good on your end. Can you just give me a thumbs up in the chat or a number 1 in the chat? Cool, awesome. All right, cool. All right, so again, my name is Diego Chavez. I'm an instructor at App Academy. App Academy is a software engineering bootcamp. I personally work part of the San Francisco campus hybrid program. It's a 16-week program. We teach full stack web development. And yeah, it's a really, really awesome program. I've met like a lot of really awesome people along the way, and I work with some really awesome people. So today we're going to dive into some CSS topics, which are my personal favorite. I know that there's already been a stream where we introduced some CSS introduction topics. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about CSS position and display properties. So how to position certain elements on the screen, how to make it so that they behave a specific way when they're placed in a specific part of the screen. And then we're going to learn all of the rules around each one of those properties. So we're going to just go ahead and take it nice and slow, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So when it comes to the display property, I like to think of everything in CSS as boxes, like building blocks, like kind of in kindergarten, you play with building blocks. And there's different rules for each type of box that you have. So there is a block, there is something called inline, and then there's something called inline-block, and then we have something called flex. And we're going to talk about all of these in depth, but the names here I've always felt are pretty semantic. So blocks is going to be like building blocks, inline is like putting things in line, and inline blocks is like putting blocks in line. So those are going to be some of the names that are going to help you, I think, kind of get along with memorizing what does what. But nothing is better than just practicing and doing it. So the first display property I want to talk about when it comes to CSS is the display block. So display block tries to be as wide as possible. If you do not give a div like a width, it's going to try to be as wide as possible. and content before or after is going to appear on a separate line. So let me go ahead and just show you what I mean. So here, I'm going to share my screen. And show you the code. So here I have a basic HTML page on my right-hand side. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is first link my CSS reset. So I'm going to link my CSS reset. CSS reset is basically this file that gives me like a clean slate. A lot of the times, whenever you use like Chrome or Safari or any other browser, those browsers already put like some default styling, right? Which honestly could create some real inconsistencies, right? So like maybe I really like to use Google Chrome and someone else really likes to use Safari. We want to make sure that any website that we build is pretty consistent across all of those browsers. So we want to start from a fresh, clean slate and remove any default styling that comes with those browsers. So this is where we use a CSS reset. This is something that you could find on the internet. You could find it. There's many of them. I personally like to use this one from meyerweb.com. Give them a little bit of credit right here. And then I just copy and paste it, and I link this here. Then what I want to do is I want to make sure that I link my style sheet where I'm actually going to apply my CSS here. So I have a blank empty CSS page here, and I'm going to link it to my index.html. So here we have it. And I want to make sure that I do it in this order, right? So I want to start off with my clean slate first, and then I want to apply my styling. If I were to flip these two things, that would be problematic because then I would just be like erasing all of the hard work that I would be doing. So display block. So if I were to do a div like this, div by default has a display block property. So if I were to give this a ID, and let's just call this block. And then I were to go here to my style.css and select it and give it a height of, let's say, 200 pixels and a background color of green and a border of 2 pixels. I want that border to be solid, and maybe I want it to be dark. As we can see, this is display block. And one of those rules of display block is that it tries to be as wide as possible. It tries to be as wide as possible. So here I have this div, and I did not write display block. I did not explicitly do display block. That is because it's just going to default to that, right? Nothing visually changed here. Now, I also didn't give it any like explicit width, right? So if I don't give it an explicit width, it's going to try to be as wide as possible. But if I do give it an explicit width, like let's say maybe I want it to be a perfect square, it will respect it. So it will, in fact, respect the width if I give it an explicit width. But if I do not, it's just going to follow the rules of display block. Try to be as wide as possible. Then I want to bring your attention to this next bullet point here. So content before and after the box appears on a separate line. That means if I were to, I'm going to go ahead and change this to a class because I'm going to have multiple blocks now. I need to select this with the class selector. If I were to have a couple of these things side by side, like so. Maybe I'll do 3. So I have 3 divs side by side. Just because they are side by side here does not mean that they are going to be side by side visually. Now, here you might be thinking, oh yeah, well, of course not, because they're taking up the entire width of the screen. But if I were to have all of these be perfect squares, 200 pixels each in width and in height, they're still not going to allow each other to be next to each other, right? And this is the idea that when something is display block, it is like building blocks, like you're building a tower of blocks, like kind of like you played with blocks when you were a kid, right? So content before and after the box appears on a separate line. So don't be fooled. Even though visually, as the coder, you can see that these things are all side by side, it really doesn't matter because these are all display block. They're all going to be built on top of each other. So I like to just go ahead and make it pretty obvious for myself because I know personally it doesn't matter. Cool. So that is display block. Tries to be as wide as possible, and content before and after appears on a separate line. Then we have something called inline. So inline is something that I usually reserved for span elements. So display inline. Some rules about this. It does in fact allow other elements to sit to its left and sit to its right. We actually cannot set a width or a height on anything that has display inline, and it doesn't respect top, bottom, or margin and padding properties. This span right here, I really like to use with text. Like if I want to emphasize a specific portion of a text, for example, if I have a p tag and it says like, welcome students. And I wanted to emphasize something about the word student. What I usually like to do in those situations is I like to wrap it in a span. So I'll go ahead and make this span element here. And this gives me a little bit more control. Now I'm saying, hey, I've wrapped this specific part of the text in this span element. And because of this rule, it's going to flow real nicely. We're not going to see any weirdness like we did with display block, right? It's just going to look like regular text to us because it does in fact allow things to sit to its left and sit to its right, just like this welcome word right here is sitting to its left. And then I can go ahead and select that span element, and maybe I can emphasize it in some way and make it red. And there we have it. So making it red, I can zoom in a little bit for you guys. That helps. So if I try to give this a height, maybe I'll do something kind of crazy like 200 pixels. We've seen nothing actually changes. If I give it a width of 200 pixels, we also see that nothing really changes. And this is because, right, we cannot have a width or a height set on anything that has a display inline property. And elements like span, right, by default have a display inline property automatically. All right, let's keep going. Then we have something called display inline block. So display inline block does allow other elements to sit to its left and sit to its right. And it does respect width, height, margin, padding, including the top and including margin and padding on the bottom. So this is kind of like the best of both worlds. It's kind of like these two things combined. So as you can see here, right, I have these elements. And right now they're just display block. Even though this is commented out, if I commented in, we know that this is just the default behavior of these kinds of divs. So if I were to change this to display inline block, well, what happens? We can see that they are now all in a row, right? We're putting our blocks into a line. It's like pretty nice naming, I think. So we're putting our blocks into a line. So that is because when we do something, when we do display inline block, we are allowing other elements to sit to its left and sit to its right. And we are able to enforce these height, this width and this height property, right? Because inline block allows us to do so, right? If this was just regular display inline, that would not be the case. So display inline block is kind of like best of both worlds, in my opinion. Cool. Are there any questions at all so far? Anything I can clarify at all? Okay. Awesome. Well, if you guys think of anything, let me know. All right. So now we're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. This is display flex. Now, display flex, I heard someone say in the chat that flex is king. Yeah, it definitely is. Display flex is this property that we add to a containing element, basically an element that contains other elements inside of it. And by attaching display flex on the parent element, we're allowed to reposition the elements inside of that container, right? Inside of that container. So flex goes on a container to affect the layout of the children. And the main idea is to give the container the ability to alter the children's placement. And we take up as much space as possible. And this is intended to be a more flexible way of managing content on our page. So I have a little diagram here to show you guys. Make this bigger. So I want to draw your attention to this top portion of this diagram. So here we have a blue container, right? This is a container. It could be like a div, something pretty straightforward. And then these orange boxes here are the children, right? So we have the parent container, and then we have the children, or the elements within the parent. Those would be the orange boxes. The idea is I want to put display flex on the blue box, on the parent container. That would give me the ability to then tell the children what to do, right? So we have this like natural flow of like authority and telling the descendants of this container where to go, how to position themselves. But one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make when they're first learning display flex is that they'll just put display flex on everything. And it's not necessary, right? We only want to put it on the parent of the things we are trying to control, right? The children. So here, the parent is the blue box. This is what display flex, this is what would have the display flex property, not the orange boxes. So let's go ahead and take a look at that in actual code. So here I am going to make a container, or actually I'll call it a parent. Making a div with the ID of parent. I'm making a div with the ID of parent. And then I'm going to give it, let's say 3 children. So if you didn't know this, when you're doing your HTML, cool little shortcut is you don't actually, if you know that you just want a div, and you don't actually have to like write div and then class and then write children like so, and then do this 3 times in a row, right? What you actually can do is you could just write dot children and then hit enter, and it'll give you this div automatically with this class of children. And what's even more cool is if you were to do dot children and then multiply it times the number of divs with that class you want, and just hit enter, it'll generate it for you. It's pretty cool, and it saves me a lot of time. And that works with like a lot of things, right? Like you could do like an ID of like test, and it'll give you a div with the ID of test. Or let's say maybe you want some LI items and you want 6 of them. It'll give you 6 LIs. It's a pretty cool trick. So here I have a parent div that contains 3 children. So the first thing I'm going to do is make it so that I can actually see what I'm working with here. So I'm going to select this parent div, and I'm going to give it a height of 400 pixels and a width of 400 pixels. And I'm going to give it a border. The border, I'm going to have it be 2 pixels in thickness. I'm going to have it be solid, and I'm going to have it be purple for now. And you can see it appear right here on the page. And then the children, I'm going to have their height be 100 pixels and their width be 100 pixels. And I'm going to give them a background color of maybe pink, and I'll give them a border of red. Awesome. So here we can see that we have this containing element that is the purple element, and then we have 3 boxes within that element. Now, if I want those boxes to align and I want to actually manipulate those pink boxes, the point I'm trying to make is that putting display flex here on the boxes themselves would actually achieve nothing in this case. It would achieve nothing in this case. That is because we want to apply it to the parent. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to say display flex, and you'll see something happen. So as you can see, visually, we had some changes, right? We had these boxes now appear in a line. Right? We had these boxes appear in a line. And that is having to do with something called a flex direction. So when you put display flex on the parent, something happens to the children, right? They basically are given a default direction, and that default direction is always row, right? Meaning that, hey, you have 2 options, right? You have 2 main options. There are more options technically, but the 2 main options are going to be column, right? So it's like, hey, do you want us to line up in a column, stacked up like blocks, or do you want us to be in a row in line? And the default is row. So even though you didn't actually see me write flex direction row, that is just how it works, right? That's its default behavior, which is why it kind of snapped directly into this line here. So we have flex direction row, and we have flex direction column. These are properties that also go on the parent, right? The parent is telling the children what to do. So I'm going to do flex direction, and I'm going to do row, and you'll see nothing changed. That's because that's just how this is its default behavior. But if you were to write column, right, it'll snap into a column. Okay, so you have options for sure, and then this gets a lot more involved, and we'll see as we're building up. This is going to be a 2-part series where we're actually going to take all of these things that we're learning today, all of the fundamentals, and then actually build like a CSS landing page with HTML and CSS, something that looks like any other website that you'll see out there. We'll build like the entire landing page once we get these foundations under our belt. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave this as flex direction row. Now remember, I don't need to write it, but I'm gonna for now. So we add display flex to a parent element. And we specify what main axis we will be using, right? So flex direction is going to take either a row or a column. And that's going to be what determines ultimately if it looks like a column or looks like a row. And that is going to determine how something called justify content will work. So let's go ahead and look at exactly what it is that I'm talking about. So we have this property called justify content when we work with something that is display flex. And there's a couple of things that can happen. So when we want the children to be centered, after we put our display flex and we specify which row we want, if we want a row or a column, let's work with row for now. So if we have justify content and we want to center everything, we would use something called center, justify content center. That would put all of the elements in the center. Then we have something called space between. So with space between, what's going to happen is it's going to put the first element as far as possible to the left and the last element as far as possible to the end, and then it'll divide the rest up evenly, right? But it's trying to put as much space between the first element and the last element, space between as much as possible. Then we have space around. Now, space around tends to be one that could be a little bit tricky. And that is because people usually confuse it with space evenly. Because at first you might look at this and think, okay, that looks pretty evenly spaced. That looks like something I want to use, thinking that you're getting something that's pretty evenly divided. But in fact, it's not. So what space around does is it gives it a certain number of pixels on each side. So let's say, for argument's sake, this is like 10 pixels, okay? And it gives it 10 pixels on each side, okay? It's also going to give it 10 pixels on this side, and on this side, and on this side, and on this side. Now, this could be a problem because if you are really going for actual evenness, you'll notice that, well, 10 plus 10, right, gives you 20. And we have 20 here, but here we only have 10. So they may be spaced evenly between each other, but against the walls, they are not. And this is a big pitfall that I see a lot of first-time students fall into because they're going to be like, oh, this is exactly what I want. It looks even, but in fact, it's not. And sometimes it's really tricky to spot. Luckily, though, Flex does give us space evenly. And this is very, very similar, except this will actually make sure that the space is even between all of the elements and like the surrounding wall. So these will all actually be even. Like, let's say this does 10 pixels. This will collapse into itself and be 10. Same thing here, and same thing here. The space evenly is actually even. Space around might look it at first, but it actually turns out that it's not. So let's see this in action. So here we have our children. Remember that I'm going to be applying all of these properties to the parent, not the children. The children are just going to listen to what the parent is saying to do. So I'm going to say justify content, and I'm going to say center. But as we can see, it moved everything to the center of the row. So that part's important. If I were to change this to column, it would move everything to the center of the column, right? So it's not like truly bullseye center in the middle. We're going to look at that in a little bit, how to actually achieve that. But when we're first starting off, we're only trying to get it centered on that axis that we decide, whether it's row or column. And again, we're going to be working with row just for now. So we have center. As we can see, This gets everything in the center. Then we have something called space between. And this, again, takes the very first element, pushes it all the way to the left, takes the very last element, pushes it all the way to the right, and then splits the difference between everything else. But it tries to get as much space as possible between that first element and that last element. And this is called space between. So the naming is actually pretty good for that one. Then we have space around. Now, again, at first, this might look even. Maybe not to everybody, but I definitely see this be something that happens a lot, is that people think that this is even, but it is not, right? If you look really, really closely, this area here is actually like half the size of this area here. So that is because it's only adding, right? Let's say in this case, maybe it's 20 pixels on each side, but here it becomes 40 because they get added together, right? So this wouldn't actually be spaced evenly. This would be spaced around. And then lastly, we have space evenly. So it's just a very small shift. Maybe some of you caught it, but it definitely happened. So this one is space evenly. And this one is one that I actually like to use a lot because it takes care of a lot for me. It just makes everything nice and even, and I like that. Okay. So if we were to look at what this looks like for a different axis, right? The column axis, it's the same concept, right? Just transposed this way. So space evenly, it tries to space everything evenly, right? Making sure that all of these spaces are even. And we are going to look at space around. All of these same rules apply. Space between. So how can we center it vertically at the same time? So we are going to talk about some other property that we're going to need in order to do that. Because as we're talking right now, we're only able to center it this way, right? But what if we want to bring it to the center of the row and then bring it center down, right? So that's actually in the middle of this div. This is where we introduce something called align items. Align items. So when we are trying to center something really, really in the true center of a div, like we're going to do now, or the point is to get it to be here, right? We have to use align items in tandem with justify content. So align item center in tandem with justify content center will actually bring it to this place that we want to achieve. So with align items and justify content center, we're able to bring it down. Now, depending on what you decide for flex direction, it's going to behave differently, but achieve the same result. Let me show you what I mean. So as of right now, justify content centers it this way first for the row, right? It centers it just in the context of a row. And then I bring it down with align item center, right? So that's the order that happens in. But if I were to do flex direction column, right? And then do justify content center, I'm centering it within the context of the column. And then when I use align item center, it'll bring it over and actually give it a true center, like visual looking effect. So it's different in the order that it executes the accesses on, but it ultimately achieves the same thing. So if you're ever trying to center something truly in the center of a div like that, using all these in tandem is usually the way to go. Yeah, no problem. All right. So these are some pretty basic flex properties that I like. I usually like to play a little game just to kind of get my point across. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up these children divs, and then here I'm going to make another class. Maybe I'll call it grandchildren. I'll do 2. No space. We're trying to do this trick. It's important not to use spaces. So here I have this first div that has these extra 2 divs in it. I'm going to go ahead and give this one an ID just to make my life a little bit easier. And I'm going to say test. So I'm testing you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and select this grandchildren. Make sure that's how I spelled it. Yeah, grandchildren. And I'm going to give them a height, let's say 50 pixels. And I'm going to give them a width of 50 pixels. And then I'm going to give them a background color of blue. And maybe a border of 1 pixel solid white, so we can see it really nicely. Let's do maybe like a teal or aqua situation. Darker. Okay, so we have these grandchildren now, right? Now, if my goal is to make these blue boxes be side by side, what do you think I should do? How do I achieve that? What would I put display flex on? Anyone have any ideas? Should I put it on the pink box? Should I put it on the purple box? Should I put it on the green box? If I was to want to say, hey, all I want to do is get these blue boxes to be side by side, I know that all I need to do is put display flex on something. Do I put it on the children, grandchildren? Okay. I see someone in the chat says children. Okay. So if I were to put display flex here, yeah, that's exactly right, right? Because remember, even though these are children themselves, right? They now have children. And so if we're trying to manipulate what's inside of those pink boxes, display flex would have to be on the surrounding container, which would be this pink box here, right? And I'm getting these blue boxes to move. And so a lot of people, what they tend to do is they just put display flex on everything, but it ends up being superfluous, right? Just extra. So there's definitely no need to put it on everything, as long as you understand that parent gets display flex, they get the power to tell the children where to go, what to do, and how to position themselves. Nice, good job. All right. So we are going to move on from the flex basics, and we're going to talk a little bit about CSS positioning. So the position property. There's a couple of them. The first one is static, and this is going to be the default position property that is applied to our HTML elements. This is when you write like a div, when you write any of these things here, you're going to automatically have a position static, meaning, hey, where you put it is where it's going to end up, right? Where you put it is where it's going to end up. No tricks. Its position will be static. Okay. Then we have something called position relative. Now this one tends to be a little sneaky, but position relative, I have like this analogy that I like to use where I like to think of position relative is kind of like haunting where it used to be, because the main idea with position relative, so I have this little diagram here, is that when I have a couple of divs, right? So let's say I have these 3 divs. I have a green div, I have a blue div, and then I have a red div. If my goal was to like just move this blue box down and to the right, I don't know why I would do that, just if I was feeling like it that day. I could use position relative, I could, but I need to understand how it works, right? So with position relative, it's visually moving, but not physically moving, which is why I like to say that it still haunts where it used to be, right? So here I'm trying to move this blue box, right? Here, right? So think of this as like situation 1, and this is situation 2. So I'm moving this blue box down and over to the right by giving it position relative, but it's still going to feel as if the blue box is there, right? Meaning that the red and the green won't collapse into each other, right? It's not going to take up space, take up that free space, because it's still going to be haunted by the old blue box. Position relative is kind of difficult to understand at first, but I think like the terminology of like, oh, it still haunts its old space is a really fun way to remember that. That's why position relative is relative to where it would be, right? So where it would normally be. So I normally put it in between this red and this blue square in situation 1, but in situation 2, I am visually moving it, but I am not physically moving it, right? Which brings us to that second bullet point of think of it as visually moving versus the element physically moving on the page. So visually it'll move, but it's still going to haunt its old stomping grounds of where you actually put it. So that being said, in a more technical explanation, the flow of the page remains the same, right? And how do we get it to move? Well, in tandem with position relative, we use top, bottom, left, and right properties, right? These are basically saying, hey, from the top, I want you to move a certain amount of pixels, right? From the bottom, I want you to move a certain amount of pixels. From the left, I want you to move a certain amount of pixels. And from the right, I want you to move a certain amount of pixels. Let's look at an example of this. So let's try to see if we can create this scenario in code. So let me work actually up here. So I'm going to, well, I already have these blocks here. So let me go ahead and give this block an ID just so I can select it a little bit more specifically. And I'll call this my ghost. So I'm going to select that ghost, and I'm going to give it a background color of red, like so. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it position relative. Now, at first, nothing is really going to happen. Here, let me go ahead actually and comment this out for now so we can hyper focus on just these 3 squares. My CSS reset. So I have position relative on this, but nothing's going to happen, right? That is because if I wanted to actually move it, I have to use it in tandem with one of the properties mentioned in the slide. That is top, bottom, left, right. These are kind of tricky to remember sometimes. I find myself forgetting the way that they move all the time. But they're really visual. So if I were to say top 100 pixels, from the top, it's going to move 100 pixels, right? Away from the top of where it normally would be, right? So imagine that it's still here, right? It's still haunting this area, right? If I were to do bottom, it'll say, hey, push yourself from the bottom 100 pixels, right? So it's pushing itself up, right? So from the bottom, push yourself up 100 pixels. From the top, push yourselves away from the top down 100 pixels of where you normally would be, right? From where your top originally is, right? Push yourself down. And left is a similar concept, right? From the left of where you would normally start, right? Remember that this red div normally would start here. It's saying push yourself from the left 100 pixels in the opposite direction. So you could assume that right works the other way. It's a little inverted, right? Because you're thinking like, oh, right, move right, but it actually visually moves left, because you have to think of the terminology as like from the right, push yourself away from the right in the opposite direction a certain number of pixels. So what if you had top and bottom set to 100 pixels? Let's give it a shot. See what happens. So top 100 pixels, and then we do bottom 100 pixels. Cool. So it looks as if it does not really like that. And it looks like for some reason, top is winning. Let me see if I switch the order here. Yeah, interesting. So it looks like they fight. That's actually really funny to know. So if my goal ultimately, right, is to get 100 pixels away from the top, maybe we'll do 500 pixels away from the top. That's too much. 100 pixels away from the top, and then from the left, we're going to move it 100 pixels. All right, we're able to actually achieve scenario 2, right? We're actually able to achieve scenario 2. And notice that there's this white space here. Now, we don't have like the luxury of having this like dotted line, right, to explain the idea that it's still haunting where it normally would be. But that is actually what's happening, right? It's haunting its old stomping ground. It's saying, hey, just because you visually moved me doesn't mean that I'm going to leave this area in a way that will remove myself from the flow of the page, right? I'm still going to respect the flow of the page, but visually you can move me, but I'm still there, right? So these two green boxes won't actually collapse into each other. Cool. So then we have position absolute. So position absolute is a little different. So it positions itself relative to the nearest non-static ancestor. We want to think of position absolute as both visually moving and physically moving out of the page. So what that means is if we were to look at the diagram again of position relative here on the left, we got to see that this blue square was still haunting its old space, right? Meaning the space was still respected as if it was there. But when we do something position absolute, the opposite really happens. So in scenario 1, right, we have the similar boxes set up, but in scenario 2, right, when we actually move the blue box to that same position, right, down and to the right of where it normally would be, what happens to the red square? What happens to the green square, right? They collapse, right? Because when we do something position absolute, we are like removing it from the flow of the page. We're removing it from the document of the page. And that basically leaves that space to be fair game for the other elements to kind of take up. So these two would probably just collapse into each other, or collapse into that space, I should say. So this is a big difference between position absolute and position relative. Right? It's not going to respect that space anymore when something is position absolute. So it uses top, bottom, left, and right properties. So we want to get it to move a specific in a specific way, we would use top, bottom, left, and right properties. Now, relative works in a way where it positions itself relative to where it would be, right? So this would be like 100% from the top, right? And 50% over to the right of where it normally would be. But with position absolute, it doesn't work in terms of where it normally would be. It works in terms of its nearest non-static ancestor, meaning it looks at this chain and saying, okay, like, do I have a parent that is non-static? If so, I'm going to position myself relative to them. So let's go ahead and break that down. So first and foremost, let's see if we can recreate this scenario. So if I were to change position relative to position absolute, we'll see some funny stuff happening, right? This is going to collapse. Let's say I'm going to say from the top, I want it to move 200 pixels. And I want to move from the left 200 pixels. Maybe we'll do 400 pixels. The diff with 300. Okay, so here we see that we were able to actually achieve this exact same scenario by doing position absolute, right? So with position absolute, we're actually physically and visually moving it. And what happened? Well, these two green boxes, right, ate up the space, right? This didn't happen with position relative at all, right? It did not happen with position relative at all. Position relative still haunts. Position absolute doesn't haunt. It's like, all right, I'll move. Just going to let it go. Now, another thing about position absolute, when it comes to this top and left property, this is talking about its nearest non-static ancestor. Its nearest non-static ancestor. So as of right now, it's going to use the body, right? It's going to use the body because all of these other ancestors, right, are going to be static. And so when that is the case, it's just going to use the body. But if I were to wrap this in a div, and let's just call it container. And I'm going to move everything. I'm going to go then style this container. I'm going to give it a border of 3 pixels. I'll make it solid, and I'll make it blue. And alrighty. So if I were to remove position absolute from this ghost here, one thing that I like to really like hammer home with some of these students is that position absolute and position relative are like awesome friends. They like love to be used together. So I'm kind of creating this like anchor system whenever I use them in tandem. So whenever I put onto the container position relative, and I put onto the child position absolute, this top and left property are going to position themselves to the container, right? Because it's its nearest non-static ancestor, right? Because we gave it position relative. So now, right, if I do 100 pixels or even 10 pixels, it's saying, hey, position yourself 10 pixels away from the top of your nearest non-static ancestor or the container, which is why, right, it's positioning itself 10 pixels away from the top of the container, right? So they're used together. 10 pixels away from the top. Same thing. So if I were to do maybe 30 pixels, Now it's positioning itself 30 pixels away from its nearest non-static ancestor, which is the blue container. And this is going to remain true no matter what we do, right? It's going to honor that. No matter what we do, it's going to honor that. It's going to say, hey, we are anchored together. So when you want something to stick together, position relative and position absolute work really well for that purpose. It's like, hey, this div needs to always be in a certain spot relative to something else. Well, the way to achieve that is have the container be position relative and have whatever it is that you're trying to sort of follow that thing around be position absolute. Right? We create this anchor system here. That one usually is a little tricky and takes some practice to get, but it's a really, really powerful tool once you get the hang of it. Okay, so then we have position fixed. So position fixed is very similar to absolute, except we don't get to do this like little fun anchor system. Instead, it is always going to position itself to like the window, to the thing that we're looking for. So the default position of an absolute position relative to its parent ancestor would be top left. So let's say that you don't have a container, right? So like if you didn't have this container, its default position would be like the body tag, essentially, like what you're looking at, like the window, so to speak, right? Or that body tag, depending on how big that tag is. Whether it takes up your whole page or just a portion of it. But then if you did not have that container, its position like top or bottom would be relative to that. But then once you put the container and that container is positioned anything other than static, then it'll anchor that. It'll anchor to that instead. No, you're all good. All right. So position fixed, same as absolute, but this time it's just always relative to the viewport, right? The thing that we're looking at. So here, if I were to make this container not position relative, but position fixed, and I were to do top 100 pixels, it's going to move itself down 100 pixels from the top of the screen of like the viewport that we're looking at. So if I were to even increase this to 1,000 pixels, right, it's going to be like, I think I might have moved it too far, but it'll be really low essentially. Let me maybe do 200 so you can see it actually go even further down, right? It'll even go further down, 300. But this is in relation to like the top of the viewport, right? This viewport that I'm looking at. And I can comment that out. Now, with position fixed, it's always going to stay there. So one thing that you can do also, little pro tip, if you're ever needing like some dummy text really quickly, if you do like a p tag, in the p tag, you do like lorem something, and you multiply it times the number of lines you need. Like, let's say I wanted like a really big amount of lines of just dummy text. I would hit lorem times like 50, right? And this is just so that I could kind of like show you that I can make this page really long, and position fixed is going to flow up and above everything, and it's going to be fixed to the very, very top if that's what I choose, right? But if I choose to fix it 100 pixels away from the top, then it'll just always be here and it'll scroll with me. So 2 things. Cool little trick. If you want dummy text, you type lorem times number of lines that you want. And then with position fixed, right, it's kind of like position absolute, but it's always relative to the viewport, and it'll stay there, right? It's like that anchor system, but to the viewport. Yeah, like a navigation bar. Now this would be like a very funky navigation bar, but yes, nonetheless, kind of how a nav bar follows you as you go. All right, let me go ahead and get rid of all this lorem text. I'm probably going to need it again in a second, but we'll review that tip. Okay, then we have position sticky. So this one, at first it's going to seem very similar to position fixed, except it's not going to remove itself from the flow of the page. So for example, here, if I actually put this back, you could see that this container here is actually like been completely removed from the flow of the page. So this is why all this text is behind it, right? But position sticky is not going to do that. It's going to have a normal flow of the document, where position fixed will actually like stop that flow, and then it'll allow everything kind of to move up, right? Kind of like position absolute, right? Where it just is going to say, oh, there's an opportunity to take up space. I'm going to go ahead and take it. That's what position fixed will allow. Position sticky will not allow that. So the element is positioned according to the normal flow of the actual document, and then it's offset relative to its nearest scrolling ancestor. So for me, I like to use position sticky for my nav bars, and you'll see why. So here for position sticky, what I'm saying is like, hey, I want to use position sticky because I don't want to make it so that everything else has the opportunity to move up, right? I don't want it so that I have everything else has the opportunity to move up and beyond, and it's going to mess up my flow, and then I'm going to have to like correct myself later down the line and kind of shift everything down and down and down. So using position sticky is a nice alternative. You can totally use position fixed. I've done it a bunch of times. There's more than one way to do to achieve building a web page, but position sticky is another alternative you could use, and it takes in a top or bottom property. And basically what this is saying is, hey, at what position do you want me to apply this scrolling property, right? This like sticky property. And for me, what I'm saying is like, oh, at the very top, right? So like at the very top, as soon as I start scrolling, right, you need to start coming along for the ride. It's not like the most technical explanation, but I think it's the most easiest to understand when you're first starting out. It's like, hey, like right at the top, I want you to start coming along for the ride. So here you're along for the ride, and here you're along for the ride, and you're always going to be at the top. And this is great because notice how nothing underneath it moves up. So I see I've made a nav bar fixed, but since there was no background color, the elements behind it were making it look messy. So this is kind of addressing that issue that we talked about, right? Where like if this was position fixed, it would allow all of those things to come up behind it. Now, this container here, you could totally give it a background color. Maybe just let's do white for now. And I'm going to give it a width of 100%. So it'll take up 100%. And then we'll have this happen here, right? So that will actually like achieve maybe the look that you might be going for. But then the problem is that everything else is actually up and tucked behind it. So then you're going to spend time like correcting the position on everything else, which is okay. I've seen people do that before where they will just like start to add margins, and then they'll like kind of like compensate for that space that they lost here. But if you wanted to do it a different way, if you wanted to try something new, you could also just do this, position sticky. And so now this is the very top of the text, starting where it was always meant to, right? Where I actually put it. The flow is going to be respected here. So as you can see, right, like these lorem ipsum texts usually start with lorem. So this is in fact the beginning of that text. And you'll see if I change it to fixed again, it goes zoop, and it goes all the way back up to the top. So definitely more than one ways to do this. This is the one that I like to do usually. But yeah, you could do position fix, give it a background color, and then just remember that you're gonna have to compensate later for that space that it kind of like took up and ate up. I'm gonna change this back to sticky. So do we have any questions about our position properties or our display properties? Again, like I said, I am going to make this a two-parter. So as of right now, we are having just the foundation kind of set out. And then my goal is to actually use these properties to build out a landing page. So we're going to actually build out a page that you would see on a website. We're going to try to make it look real nice, real professional, real clean. And all of the things that we talked about today are necessary in order to do that. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So hopefully you guys will come back for a part 2 where we actually build a page, and we'll be using display flex. We're going to be doing position absolute, position relative, tying things together, position sticky. We'll be doing all of these things, and you'll see how, oh, okay, how does that actually apply to what I'm doing, right? Because as of right now, we're just playing around with like a bunch of boxes and moving them around. But that is a really necessary step in order to learn the foundation of what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, it really is just a bunch of boxes. And we're going to see how we can make those boxes look into like some real clean, nice, professional websites. Cool. Awesome. Any last questions I can answer for any of you? Could be about App Academy or anything we talked about today. Yeah, you're welcome. No problem. All right. Well, if there are no questions, you can definitely always watch this later, whether it's on YouTube, and maybe if you wanted to rewatch a certain part, see how I did something. Hopefully that those will get your questions answered. But yeah, I will see you guys next time when we do the part 2. Build a nice little website. All right. Bye, everybody.